Aloha everyone, it is Ajanette and I am here to do your personality disorder lecture. And so your readings this week are all covering kind of some of the primary personality disorders, and personality disorders are always just a little bit sad for me because they're not always treatable. Number one, because the people who are experiencing the disorder aren't often, self-aware, or they don't have accurate perceptions of themselves or others. And so they're not able to acknowledge that there is a problem, and or they're not willing to seek treatment. So unfortunately, that means that there's very little, opportunity to get help. And so there's low success rates in actually treating disorders. So let's dive in, and we need to start by talking about what is personality in general. And when I'm talking about personality, it's so much more than mood, right? And it's so much more than interests. It is really about enduring patterns of how we view the world, how we engage the world, how we engage one another in relationships, and really our perceptions overall. And that includes perceptions of ourselves, perceptions of others, and perceptions of our environment. It very much is contextual. For example, myself, I often come across as very extroverted, very dynamic. Part of my job is to stand up in front of people and talk, right? And in a professional capacity, that very much is who I am. I'm very comfortable in front of a room and an audience. However, personally speaking, when you put me in a personal context, I do not like to be in the spotlight. I'm very introverted. In fact, I'm kind of a bit of a homebody. So context matters. It elicits different personality traits from me within those different contexts. And that's the case for everybody. And when we're talking about a disorder, that also is referring to very pervasive, persistent patterns that emerge, but they're often deviations. They violate norms or expectations. And so people demonstrate very distinct perceptions about themselves or others or environments than would be expected by a reasonable person for those circumstances. They often tend to have very kind of rigid, pervasive perceptions that are resistant to change, resistant to input, resistant to suggestion. And we typically start to see these signs emerge in adolescence, and they will continue throughout adulthood, really throughout their lifetime. And unfortunately, it's those very things that make them resistant to seeking help and then receiving and benefiting from that help when they are in that context. And sadly, when we're talking about distress or impairment, it might impair them in terms of, hinder their ability to have successful relationships, or, cause a lot of instability in relationships or even in work settings. However, it may or may not be distressing to them. Some personality disorders, the individual themselves does not experience the distress, but those around them might be distressed. And so that's important to note as well. You have 4 distinct features of personality disorders. Number 1, they have distorted thinking patterns or perceptions of the world. The way in which they perceive the world does not often align with how a reasonable person might interpret that circumstance or relationship. They also respond emotionally differently than would be expected for that circumstance, either unstable emotional responses, unpredictable emotional responses, erratic emotional responses, and or no emotional response, right? And we'll talk about the different disorders and how that might be manifested. Then their actual impulse control. For some of these disorders, they have very, rigid control over their impulses. And for others, they don't. there's absolutely zero impulse control, and they can be very impulsive in nature. And then their relationships. They often have challenged, strained relationships for just cause. These types of behaviors, personalities, and perceptions can be very challenging on a relationship, and it's hard to maintain a relationship with an individual with any of the personality disorders we're going to talk about today. Okay, so it really is important to note that children cannot be diagnosed with a personality disorder. The APA is very clear on that. They may have some symptoms that sound like a personality disorder or that are very similar. They might have like their little idiosyncrasies or their oddities or eccentricities, and we might think, oh, they're kind of an odd duck. However, that might alert us to just be mindful and to watch those individuals as they continue to develop. But a formal diagnosis cannot occur until they're at least 18 years of age. Now, in childhood, they might be diagnosed with things like disinhibited social engagement disorder, reactive attachment disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder, intermittent explosive disorder, or anxiety disorders. And those might, as they age, sometimes they might alleviate, sometimes they might continue as an anxiety disorder or as another type of disorder, or it'll often now meet the criteria for a diagnosis of a personality disorder, and they will in fact be diagnosed with a personality disorder. So often, but not always. When we talk about personality disorders, they fall into three separate clusters or classifications. You have the odd and eccentric cluster, you have the dramatic, emotional, or erratic cluster, and then you have the anxious or fearful cluster. Notice that for each one of these clusters, it represents a small percentage of the population. So higher than schizophrenia, but nowhere close to like anxiety or depression that we see, right? And so these are odd, I think, are not odd, rare. And I do see that we commonly use these terminologies, these terminologies to describe like maybe an asshole, but they actually don't meet the diagnostic criteria. And sometimes when we're misusing these terms, it contributes to stigma and it undermines the effectiveness or our ability to truly address these issues when they do arise. So be careful how you use these terms and be careful about mislabeling someone. It's okay to talk with someone when you do see some signs and when you do have some concerns. Wrap it in love, right? Sandwich it in love. Come to them explaining your intentions and your concern. Share with them the explicit concerns, and then wrap it back in love again and share with them how important they are, right? But be prepared that they may not be receptive. They may become angry, bitter, resentful, and potentially even hostile. So, I know a lot of people tiptoe and they don't want to raise the concerns, but I think it's still very valuable and important to address the issues. So that being said, each cluster has its own distinct personality disorders assigned to that cluster. What you have in cluster A is kind of social awkwardness, social withdrawal, and these are often associated with schizophrenia type symptoms, which we'll talk more about. Cluster B, it's antisocial, borderline, histrionic, and narcissistic. These definitely impact emotional regulation, impulse control, and they have a direct impact on relationships. We might actually identify individuals with these types of personality disorders as being toxic. And so it's important that we're understanding that and addressing that. And then anxious and fearful cluster actually includes symptoms that really are similar to that found with many anxiety disorders and or depressive symptoms, which often co-occur with anxiety, as you've learned. And so they actually can be receptive and responsive to treatment, and some of the same treatments that we would use for anxiety or depression might actually be helpful for these personality disorders as well. So although we're talking about this kind of categorical way of understanding and learning about personality disorders through the three different clusters, not everybody believes that personality disorders should be separated into categories. Some think that it's more dimensional, right? Where we have a personality that shows some paranoia, that shows some anxiety, that shows some impulse control issues. And so they look at each of those traits on kind of a spectrum, and like what each disorder is multidimensional and multifaceted, where we have varying degrees of those various traits, and so that's an alternative perspective. It's always important to welcome healthy discourse and debate in our field, and our general acceptance as professionals changes and evolves, which is why we update our diagnostic and statistical manual. So right now, the prominent way in which we look at these disorders is through the clustered and categorical approach. So just another visual representation if this table is more helpful for you based upon your varied learning style. So let's dig in and talk a little bit about cluster A. So cluster A kind of centers around those socially awkward kind of paranoia type traits, some of which may resemble what we talked about from the schizophrenic spectrum disorders from a previous module, but there's often a distrust, a suspicion of other people. They might feel like people are out to get them, people are trying to hurt them. They may actually feel harmed and violated by others, and there's no really clear apparent evidence. And so they are constantly existing in a state of suspicion of those around them. And that skepticism is not just applied toward, the world at large. It's actually applied toward people that are close to them, maybe even caretakers, loved ones, and even therapists, which is why it becomes challenging, right? They don't necessarily believe that anyone can be loyal to them. Anyone is worthy of their trust. Anyone is looking out for their safety and well-being. And that suspicion in the relationship erodes the trust. It erodes their confidence and ability to receive the benefits of that relationship, particularly when you're talking about a therapeutic relationship. So they might constantly be misinterpreting things or skewing things because it aligns with their paranoid assumptions and perspectives of the world at the time. So sadly, that can lead to a lot of bitterness, resentment building, and they're not likely to engage in a reciprocal, forgiving, flexible, supportive relationship. In fact, they may be hostile. They may actually be very reactive and emotionally angry, and certainly there's going to be accusations flying, and they might attack you in response to how they perceive themselves as being attacked. So maybe very defensive as well. I'm going to just go ahead and fix that typo while I'm there, if you don't mind. Okay, great. Let me launch back up. Awesome. Thanks for your patience with me. Okay, so now when we talk about the specific disorder, schizoid personality disorder is one of the disorders in cluster A. And these individuals will likely avoid relationships, that social connection. They have very limited emotional expression, and so interpersonal settings may be challenging for them to thrive in. They're often, some people might actually see them as being similar to someone who has autism and or schizophrenia, but they don't. And remember that this often is linked to a diagnosis of schizophrenia later, but they don't show that connection through facial expressions and gestures as we do in kind of ongoing regular relationships. They also may not have people that they identify as friends. So social exchanges with these people might be awkward or non-existent altogether. And they really don't want to engage. They prefer to be on their own. Some people might classify them as loners. And, they typically have a very small circle, often limited to just their very own family. And so you won't see them really initiating relationships or friendships. They also might be asexual and just not interested in sexual relationships, or maybe they do have sexual desires, but they really don't want the romantic part of the relationship or the social part of the relationship. And, they might kind of appear numb when others are criticizing them or even complimenting them. And so that extreme isolationist mindset definitely limits their capacity to engage. So another personality disorder we see in cluster A is schizotypal personality disorder, again often leading to a schizophrenia diagnosis. They too have many social impairments and deviations. They too might have very odd distortions or perceptions of the world, and maybe even delusional to some extent. And people might view them as very odd and eccentric, and they too have limited relationships. However, with this one, they also have ideas of reference, where they think that kind of everything, maybe not everything, but things are about them that really have nothing to do with them. So they think that, events that have occurred, or behaviors or something in a relationship, that it's all about them. And so again, they might feel like they're a little bit more of the center of attention or being targeted than what they really are. They also might be obsessed with paranormal activities, ghosts, things of that nature as well. They might even think that they have special magical powers, and they might have hallucination that go along with that. And similar to what we talked about with schizophrenia, those irregular speech patterns, right? That kind of vocal word salad type thing, or the echolalia, right? Where they repeat things. And they too are concerned about the motives of others, and being close and trusting others. And so they are typically very socially anxious, and don't express a lot of emotion or connection to others. Now moving on to cluster B. And so for cluster A, we saw the paranoid, right? We saw the schizoid, and we see the schizotypal personality disorders. Those are the three disorders. One that really has paranoia at the forefront. Schizoid still does have some paranoia, which is why they're clustered together, right? But they very much avoid social relationships altogether. And then the schizotypal personality disorder, which actually has a lot of symptoms of schizophrenia, including the hallucinations, beyond just the paranoia and the relationship deficits. Okay, so moving into cluster B, we're going to start with antisocial personality disorder, which is the big one, right? So when you hear psychopath or sociopath, this is what they're describing. I want to be mindful because a lot of people think that a psychopath or a sociopath automatically means a serial killer. It doesn't. Not all psychopaths and sociopaths are serial killers. However, pretty much all serial killers are in fact psychopaths or sociopaths. Um, and we're not talking about like mass murder where a person might go on a shooting rampage in one particular incident. We're talking about a series of events where they harmed and took the life of another, right? And so in separate and distinct events, because someone might have a psychotic break and go on a one-time killing spree that kills multiple people, such as a mass shooting, but that doesn't necessarily mean they have antisocial personality disorder. So when you're talking about sociopaths, they really don't have any sense of morality, connection, duty, obligation to others. So consequently, they completely disregard the rights of others, and they have no problems violating other human beings. Now, that doesn't always mean physically, doesn't mean they're always going to physically harm you. Many would argue that Bernie Madoff, who violated people financially and stole their life savings for his own personal financial gain, was in fact a sociopath, right? And so he wasn't going off murdering people, but he was definitely undermining their quality of life, right? And so these people are more comfortable violating social norms. They might actually get arrested for property destruction, harassment, assault, stealing, because they just don't necessarily think the rules apply to them, or that they have no problems violating those rules, right? They're very much okay kind of bending rules, being deceitful, going through these very elaborate plans to deceive and harm others, and whether that's for financial gain or otherwise. They can also be impulsive, irritable, aggressive, and selfish, and that's important to note, right? Because they can be reactive, but they're not always. So they might have one relationship where they're actually very hostile and aggressive, and then they might have another relationship where they're actually calm and they appear to be wonderful and kind. And that's part of the deceitfulness, right? The masks that they might wear. They may have a hard time holding down jobs. They may have a hard time financially. They also might engage in high-risk behaviors. So whether that's DUIs, or whether that's gambling or prostitution or substance abuse, whatever it might be. You typically will see some signs in childhood and early adolescence. Cruelty to animals can be a sign, like starting fires, kind of testing how far they can go with hurting someone. And they're trying to understand their reaction, and sadly sometimes their lack of reaction as well. So they typically will display a lack of conscience and remorse, so they don't feel guilt and shame, because again, they don't feel any regard for the rights and needs of others. And so consequently, as you can imagine, they don't have strong and robust social relationships. They will typically, when they have challenges in a relationship, they blame it on the other person. It's never their fault. It's always the victim's fault. They made me do it. And they also kind of dismiss the severity of their actions. It's no big deal. You're overreacting. Or they just really don't care and they're completely indifferent. And so you typically can see red flags early in life and even before their mid-teens, but they officially cannot be diagnosed until 18. So typically a child that's displaying these tendencies will be diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder during their childhood, because there's several signs, but the diagnostic is limited to 18 years of age or older. And conduct disorder, where they're violating those norms as well. Then another cluster B disorder, which is one of the more common disorders as well, is borderline personality disorder. So this also has tremendous instability. This actually reminds me of Katy Perry's song, "You're hot, then you're cold, you're yes, then you're no, you're in, then you're out." We often talk about people that are unpredictable and erratic as being bipolar. And bipolar, they definitely go through episodes, but a depressive episode, typically of 2 weeks or longer, a manic episode, they're extended periods covering multiple days quite often, and sometimes weeks. But borderline personality, it happens in a split second. Like within a conversation, you can see them flip a switch, right? And it's, you love me, you hate me, you love me, you hate me. Very what we would perceive as toxic relationship. And what's really sad is it's often centered in deep, deep insecurity and fear of abandonment. So they're constantly feeling like you're going to leave them, like you're going to abandon them. And so, they're flinging around accusations and accusing you of different things, and their fears are, bouncing off the walls, or they might become angry and enraged with you as a result of that. So that very unstable mood and the fluctuations and the unpredictability becomes very laborious for the people around them. And it might even result in violence. They become so erratic and impulsive. They also often engage in self-harm. So when we think about cutting, when we think about, high risk taking, this often might be associated with suicide attempts, with drug and alcohol addiction as well. Engaging in high risk sexual behavior, and all of this is their desperation to be loved, to be accepted, to be supported, but their fear of abandonment often results in a self-fulfilling prophecy where they drive people away, and they're left with painful sense of emptiness, loneliness, and it's kind of a very tragic disorder from my view, and that paranoia might actually hinder them from getting help and seeking help, and it limits the ability for that help to be effective and productive. Then there's histrionic personality disorder. Think of histrionic as extremes, right? They also kind of see the world as black and white. There's not a lot of gray or middle ground or in between. And so they also might, exist emotionally in those extremes. And they also might engage in extreme attention seeking as well. And so they want to be the center of attention. These are the drama queens, right? Where, they want everything to be about them. They tend to be very dramatic and very overzealous, and kind of the sky is falling. And even their mannerisms might be very theatrical, and how they communicate might be very grandiose, right? And they might even engage in storytelling and lies just so that they can get the center of attention, or they might exaggerate things to draw attention to themselves. They also might, want to be a little bit more attention-seeking in their behavior, so they dress in a provocative way. They might have, their breasts out, or things might be a little tighter or smaller than, what would you might think would be appropriate. And they're obsessed about looking good because they want it's highly centered around attention, right? Whereas borderline, they really want to be loved. This is all about attention. I want to be the center of attention. I want to be the star. I want to be the limelight. And they can also be easily, maybe manipulated. You can plant seeds, and they are going to follow the fads and the trends of the day and in the moment. And, they might even, talk about their best friends and be name droppers and talk about, how they have this in or this connection. And they're probably exaggerating the nature of those relationships. And then finally, the last cluster B disorder we're going to talk about is narcissistic personality disorder. And sadly, a narcissist is someone that has very highly inflated views of themselves. So they might think that they are more intelligent than they are, that they're more skilled than they are. And unfortunately, it's distorted, right? And so I've unfortunately had a lot of experience with narcissistic personality disorder. I spent 16 years of my life with someone with this disorder, and it was all about how wonderful they were, and they really didn't have a lot of regard and empathy and compassion for me or others in our lives. So it was all about appearances. They were very pretentious. They loved to brag about how wonderful they are. And if there was something about me that they could brag about too, they would, right? Not to me, but to others, because, they wanted to hold out these, incredible appearances, and they wanted others to admire them and look up to them, and, oh, what a wonderful person you are, and, oh, how you have accomplished so much and you're so successful. And so that appearance is one of an inflated self-esteem, when in reality they might actually be a little bit more fragile inside. They actually are more dependent, but they don't show it. And sadly, they may be able to have a healthy, wonderful, functional relationship, and they might get authentic admiration and support from others. But, after you go around expressing how wonderful you are and belittling others, it takes a toll. And so ultimately they can get angry, they can get very irritable and reactive when you are not honoring what they believe to be, them and what they're entitled to. What's really interesting is they take all the credit for the great stuff. They don't take any of the blame for the bad stuff. They really lack the ability to look at themselves and find fault in themselves. And so they will never accept responsibility and never acknowledge their part in a problem. And that makes them resistant to treatment, right? They really not only have a hard time understanding themselves, but understanding others. And that often results in a very unhealthy exchange, a relationship that is often one way and exploitative, where they're taking, and they're not giving in that same reciprocal manner. And so their constant quest for, achievement and success and being the grand master of all, unfortunately, doesn't allow them to lift others, right? And to acknowledge the value that others bring as well. Okay, so let's move on to the cluster C disorders. And here you have avoidant personality disorder. And this is extreme social inhibition, where they really are avoiding relationships. They don't want to be judged. They don't want to be criticized. They're doing everything in their power because they're just very much overly sensitive, even to the possibility of being judged. So they don't want to engage in any kind of social situation that might put them at risk. That might be something as simple as going to school, going to class, maintaining a job, right? Because they don't want to be evaluated, rejected, or judged in any way. And unfortunately, that means they limit relationships, because within relationships, right, we go through, especially when we're just forming a relationship, we go through a period where we're worried about being judged and where we actually are judging one another, right? Maybe not in a condemnation type way, but maybe in a way of assessing, is this a good fit for me? And so consequently, that potential of being rejected or judged negatively is too much for them. And they're so overly embarrassed or so overly consumed with the fear of the negative consequences, they avoid those relationships altogether. And so, you might think this is social anxiety, but it's not. This is really centering around a negative self-concept where they feel like, something's wrong with me. And it can be very pervasive and very disabling for them. So very extreme fear of rejection, more so than what you would see in social anxiety. Dependent personality is almost opposite of what we've been talking about. These people actually need someone to take care of them. They do have a fear of abandonment, and they're so afraid that that a person may not come back, that they don't want to separate for someone. It's often someone in a caretaker role, like a spouse or a parent, maybe an older sibling that they kind of cling to. And so, they have a very childlike relationship where they cling to them, they're submissive to them, and they rely 100% on them to complete them and to take care of them and to make their decisions for them. And they don't branch out and become independent, and they're unable to make those decisions on their own. They often, unfortunately, aren't comfortable challenging or questioning who they perceive as their caretaker. And so it makes them very vulnerable, right? They feel helpless. They feel that vulnerability. And hopefully they're with a caretaker that understands that and does take care of them and balances their needs. But it's they're not able to spread their wings and step out of the nest, and they need to, right? But they just don't have the confidence or the sense of self-efficacy and empowerment yet. They feel helpless when they're out on their own. And then there's obsessive compulsive personality disorder. Now, this is not OCD. This is a personality disorder, OCPD. And it very much can center around orderliness and cleanliness and perfectionism, just like you might see in OCD. However, when you're talking about OCPD, this is like a pervasive personality trait, right? And that perfectionism, they may not have the obsessions and the compulsions like you see in OCD, but they might have very strict standards for perfectionism for themselves and others. It can definitely impact their relationships and their own sense of stress. I really feel like perfectionism undermines our sanity and well-being, and the rigidity and the demandingness in their personalities hurts their relationships, undoubtedly, right? Those high standards, and you just feel like it's never good enough. You're never going to be able to meet expectations. That takes its toll. And so it can be a very challenging circumstance, not just for the person experiencing it, but for those around them. So you'll see with all of them, right? They impact not just the patient or the client, but they impact the entire circle of that client. So you can see in terms of prevalence rates, right? Thankfully, these disorders are rare. The highest one being at 6.2% for narcissistic personality disorder. But the majority of them are rare, like under or around 2%. of the general population. Now, some of them you see in both genders, but in others you don't, right? There's a clear gender difference. Like with schizotypal, it's more common in men, as is antisocial personality disorder, narcissistic, very much more common in men. But the others, like borderline, histrionic, and the avoidant and dependent, are more common in women. And so, important to note that as well. And then here's just another visual for the epidemiology of these disorders for those of you who might benefit more from a visual chart. And then in terms of comorbidity and other co-occurring disorders, most definitely mood disorders, particularly major depression. We see that with the cluster A and the cluster B, cluster C. Let me go back. Major depression we see with cluster C predominantly. Remember, that's a lot of fear-based. And then you see it the lowest in cluster A. Bipolar disorder comes most commonly with cluster B, so the histrionic and the borderline personality disorder, and the narcissistic and the antisocial. Dysthymia, which is kind of that mild depression, right? We actually see this commonly occurring with all of the personality disorders. You actually see it commonly occurring with many disorders, right? And then anxiety disorders, general anxiety we see with narcissistic personality disorders, schizoid personality disorder, and avoidant. You don't really see a lot of, differentiation with specific phobias, so there's no like clear evidence of it for one type of personality disorder over another. Social phobia is most common with avoidant personality disorder, which makes sense, right? Because it's almost that extreme version of social anxiety disorder. And then panic disorder, we see this with narcissistic personality disorder. They might actually have recurring panic attacks, which might actually aggravate them and make them feel like they need to be even more defensive and protective. And then substance use you see most commonly among antisocial, borderline, and schizotypal, and maybe as a means of self-medication. When we're talking about what causes these disorders, there is some evidence to suggest that genes are related. Specifically with schizotypal, we see it could be related to the ventricles like we saw with schizophrenia, and higher dopamine levels also, which we see in schizophrenia. And remember, this often is a precursing diagnosis, and they often are later diagnosed with schizophrenia. And then antisocial and borderline personality disorder, we see it related to serotonin rather than dopamine, and they might actually have challenges in their frontal lobe. Remember, that's decision making, that's planning, that's impulse control, that's just their ability to make sound reasoned decisions and perceptions of the world. And then it might also be related to their amygdala, which is like their impulse and aggression center within the brain as well. And then in terms of psychological causes, from a psychodynamic perspective, of course, we're going to look at childhood. We're going to look at the nature of those relationships with their parental figures, most notably the mom. Were they healthy? Were they able to establish healthy parental relationships? Typically not when you're talking about personality disorders. Now, whether or not, it's the chicken or the egg, we don't know. Maybe the very challenged and strained personality traits that were evident even in childhood contributed to a strained parental relationship, or maybe the strained parental relationship actually is what contributed to the challenging personality traits. It's hard to say. But we do see higher rates of personality disorders with people who have experienced trauma, whether it's poverty, domestic violence, or some other abuse or trauma throughout their lives. They typically, if you go to a prison that has higher rates of individuals with these disorders, one of the things they have in common is they've had kind of a really sucky childhood experience. They themselves may have been neglected, abused by their own parents, or they've been high rates of being in the foster system themselves, or high rates of parental death at a young age, or being abandoned, or maybe their parents, became drug addicts and left them. And so that family environment is highly associated with personality disorders. In terms of cognitive explanations for why these disorders may occur, they're going to focus on their perceptions, right? Their thought patterns. And they typically are very clearly demonstrating faulty and inaccurate, distorted perceptions of the world, of themselves, of others. And those maladaptive thought patterns can only persist throughout life, and then as they experience trauma and challenges, it kind of reinforces those maladaptive thinking, and they might actually interpret things through a bias lens, like a confirmation bias, where they try to interpret anything that happens as evidence for their kind of distorted view and interpretation. They also might engage in this dichotomous thinking, this black or white, it's all or nothing. We definitely see this with histrionic, right? Definitely see this with the dependent and borderline disorders. And then undermining the positive, discounting it, focusing more on the negative. Definitely you're going to see this with avoidant personality disorder, where they're so fearful of criticism and they're desperately afraid of rejection. Other psychological explanations is the behavioral model, where they're going to suggest that throughout their lives, they've had reinforcement of these negative personality traits that have caused them to become more repetitive and persistent, and it's hindered their ability to develop effective social skills. Or it's been modeled because they have other people in their lives who may demonstrate these personality traits and these maladaptive patterns. And so watching other family members that are unhealthy, dysfunctional, contributes to them developing those things as well. The challenge is a lot of these things may not be rewarded, and yet they still persist. But parents sometimes unknowingly reinforce behaviors like dependent personality disorder, right? By continuing to be a caretaker, by coddling them, by not giving them opportunity to step out and experience that independence, by not empowering them at a young age to start thinking about situations and making their own decisions, by not giving them any room to question you. That might actually be building and creating the risk or circumstances for a dependent personality. So those are all things to think about. And socially, that family dysfunction, right? That trauma, whether it's domestic violence or poverty, or maybe a parent lost a job and it had huge financial ripple effects to the whole family, or there was a divorce and a separation, whatever it might be, where that family goes through trauma and division, that dysfunction or just a dysfunctional high conflict family environment might contribute to the development of these disorders. And then most certainly child abuse, whether it's emotional, physical, sexual, or neglect. All of these things put children at greater risk. Now, how do we treat these disorders? Well, for the paranoid, schizoid, and schizotypal in cluster A, as I mentioned at the start of this, they often don't seek treatment, right? They don't see that they need help. They don't see that they might be actually contributing to the problem, and they don't trust other people anyway. So the idea of forming a trusting therapeutic relationship is really a struggle. They're suspicious constantly, and so they may not be able to form that bond and connection and receive that advice and act on the advice that they're getting from a therapy session. But the therapist nonetheless will try to engage them in cognitive restructuring, help them look at how they are perceiving the world, identify where there might be distortions at play, and give them guidance and skills on how to reframe and build healthier perceptions. They might also engage in more explicit, intentional social skills training, teaching them how to interact in healthy, constructive ways. And then for cluster C, avoidant, dependent, obsessive, compulsive, they might actually remember anxiety is often associated with some of these, and so, or depression. They might actually seek treatment for the anxiety and depression, but not the personality disorder. They may be in complete denial that they have a personality disorder. Again, grounded in that fear that they're going to criticize me, reject me. And so the therapist, when they have the opportunity to treat them, they're going to really help them identify what specific thoughts, mindsets, perspectives are causing distress in your life, are contributing to these kind of unhealthy, contentious thoughts and relationships. And they're going to move you away from that. And they're going to try to teach you how to allow for grace for yourself and others. They're going to, bring you into the gray or bring you into the rainbow so you're not, either or living in extremes. They're going to try to help you understand how to recognize what you have control of and what you don't, and how to emotionally let go of what you don't have control of, to regulate those emotional responses, and to try to give yourself compassion and grace, and not try to be so demanding and perfectionist with yourself or others. And then finally, treating cluster B, which is the more common, more familiar, more kind of Hollywoodized as well, antisocial. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of effective treatment for them. You can have therapists that try to address that lack of conscience and morality, but very, very low success rates, if at all. And then for borderline personality, dialectical behavioral therapy does tend to have some success when you can get them in with a specialist and get them to stay in treatment. Marsha Linehan suggested that the goal should be to reduce self-harm, because remember, these individuals are more likely to engage in cutting and other self-harm or destructive high-risk behavior. And you are going to try to make sure you're quickly addressing the behavior that keeps them from engaging in therapy and engaging in effective therapy. And you're going to try to give them skills and tools and resources and perspectives that can help them have a healthier perspective on life and overall quality of life. And you're going to try to reduce the PTSD symptoms. And so that involves giving them appropriate social skills, training them how to be mindful, how to manage their body's response to stress, teaching them about the importance of tolerance and intolerance, right? And how they can have more effective, tolerant relationships with others, how to regulate their emotions and not be so reactive and demanding. You want to try to reinforce and build and inspire and nurture that sense of motivation to do better, to improve towards self-growth. And you want to give them in-the-moment coaching. So as they're engaging in that negative behavior, sometimes if they're in a situation, they have access to the therapist's cell phone number, or they can text them, or they can engage in a video conference, and in the moment they can get some really important practical hands-on coaching to help guide them through a particular situation. They're also invited into their own case management, and they get to help problem solve with the therapist. So they're not just a passive recipient of the therapy and of the solutions. They actually will participate in choosing which solutions make the most sense and are most viable. And then finally, they have a team. The therapist is not alone. They can go back and consult with a team. I think of this like the my oncologist who had a tumor board, and they went back and consulted with other doctors about the treatment that they were doing and what they were recommending. Same thing with somebody who practices this dialectical behavioral therapy. That is part of their training and certification, is they have a consultation team where they can always bring their cases back and have somebody to discuss their treatment with. And then histrionic personality disorder, they actually will seek out treatment. However, it's often unsuccessful because they can be very demanding with a clinician. Also, they might try to seduce the clinician, and they see they're trying to get, they want to be that center of attention. They're very dramatic and theatrical, and they want all eyes on them. And that can, as you might imagine, undermine a relationship. I know I've had, one time I had a student who was, talking to me about my rejection and of him, and I was like, we have to really clearly establish boundaries. I'm your teacher, right? I'm supposed to offer critique. I'm not your girlfriend, right? And so this is, although I believe that girlfriends should be afforded opportunity to offer critique as well, but that's not the nature of the relationship. And so sadly, when you move these out of a professional context, it can be challenging, right? In their own minds, even though the clinician might be completely professional. And so you really want to help them identify that dependence, kind of break that string and that dependence, and help them become much more independent and have healthier, more realistic, adaptive beliefs and mindsets about the world. And narcissistic, almost untreatable. They really are too busy thinking of themselves as so wonderful they don't need the treatment, and they really have a hard time acknowledging flaws within themselves and are constantly blaming others. So a therapist has to really work hard to break through those barriers and teach them how to empathize with others, teach them how to have an accurate self-perception, and teach them how to have healthier, functional, adaptive relationships with themselves and others. And so as we close today, I'm going to leave you with some words of wisdom and inspiration. First of all, I have a personality disorder. I'm not toxic. I'm not manipulative. I'm not abusive. I'm not going to ruin your life. I'm not an attention seeker. I deserve just as much awareness and understanding as those with other mental illnesses. And I can say I'm sometimes even guilty of this, where I do not show them the grace and compassion for this disorder that I might for others. And so please know that just like any other disorder, they do deserve our compassion, our empathy, and our advocacy as well. And you may yourself have experienced abandonment and betrayal, and it hurts. And so imagine living in a constant state of fear of abandonment and the pain that they often carry, that is inspiring and triggering their maladaptive behaviors. So again, I'm going to always encourage you to step into the shoes of compassion, sensitivity, and advocacy. Do your best, but at the same time, don't, you can only do so much to help others. And when they're not able to help themselves, you also have to establish some boundaries for yourself as well. And that's okay to do that, but do it in love and do it in compassion. Much love and aloha to all of you. Bye-bye.